The Indian healthcare sector has transformed drastically over the last 3 to 4 years. During this transformation, one of the key standpoints where the awareness is increased to beyond measure are clinical trials. Today we have with us Mr. Sanjay Vyas, Country Head India and Managing Director Parexel, to discuss about navigating through the challenges, triumphs and some of the best practices that his organization has been deploying in the area of clinical trials. First and foremost, thank you very much, sir, for giving your time for this discussion with us.
No, thank you and appreciate it.
Before we delve into the details, could you tell our viewers from a layman's perspective as to what does a clinical trial mean?
No, absolutely. I think it's very critical to understand that people think that whatever drugs today that are dispensed in the pharmacy, they magically land out there, right? But if you really look back, every drug or every therapy before it comes into the market has to go through a life cycle of testing. It starts from animal testing to the first patient in, and then a full-fledged testing of those drugs onto the patient to test its efficacy, to the safety piece of it, and then finally the outcome of the drug on the patient in that perspective. So this whole life cycle that the drug goes through in a research form on the patients is all what clinical trial is all about. Now, absolutely, this whole cycle can take place anywhere between 3 to 7 to 15 years for a drug to come into the market. So that's what clinical trial is all about.
Sure. You know, during post-COVID and during COVID as well, India's handling of COVID was greatly applauded by the entire world, be it the vaccination system or be it the measures taken post-COVID for patients to recuperate. Everything stood out. Another thing that stood out is how India has become a hub for clinical trial vis-a-vis the entire world. What do you think are some of India's unique strengths that have made India land this place?
Yeah, there are a couple of factors that add to that, and but as you rightly mentioned, that if you'd have probably asked this question 15 years ago, the situation was much different. There was a time when clinical trials were conducted massively within India, but of course, due to some compliance challenges and local ethical code of conduct issues, a lot of these clinical trials were pulled out of the Indian market. But if you really seen in the last 15 years, one, the first factor, in 2019, the DCGI came up with the revamped clinical trial regulations. That was a big change, because if you really look at those clinical trial regulations today, they're at par with the US FDA or the European EMEA regulations.
Wonderful.
As well. So that's one great thing. Now that has literally put the landscape of how clinical trials are conducted with the same level of ethics and compliance has brought on par. The second piece, if you really look, as you rightly mentioned, COVID really pivoted a lot of that challenges as well, because there was a time when questions were being asked in terms of the way the clinical trial was conducted in India. But during COVID, a lot of these therapies were brought in, and there was a lot of compliant process that was followed to get these therapies back into the market as well, right? So that further pivoted, and the knowledge about clinical trial became a little bit more rampant, because 4 or 5 years back, you would have sat and asked somebody what a clinical trial is. People were really not aware, but suddenly during COVID, it became a dinner table conversation. Everybody was asking, which vaccine is better? How many patients were recruited in this particular therapy? You know, which vaccine should I be going for, or we should be going in for, right? People were doing research on the data that was being published, right? So suddenly that also helped pivot a lot of the stuff. But I think the most important factors that driving India today towards the clinical trial landscape is, one, is its ecosystem, the healthcare ecosystem. At this point of time, with the healthcare infrastructure, when you look at the hospitals, the investigator sites in tier 1, tier 2 cities, it's really one of the state of the art. Like the last mile delivery of the healthcare to the patients is also one of the state of the art in India as well. So that's one part. The second is the increasing size of the skill set from an education perspective. So if you really look back from the skills that are required today to conduct clinical trials, right? India produces today the largest number of pharmacy graduates in the world. It produces the largest number of physicians in the world. We have a good skill set in terms of biostats, stats programming, data management. So literally, like there is not, you can actually manage an entire protocol sitting in this part of the world, whether it's a study conducted globally or study conducted in India. And that's what Parexel does today with 6,000 people here across 18 functions. It's like a mini clinical research organization. So that's another piece of it. And then obviously, the other factor is, I think, the industry, the academia, the government, they've all started to come together to discuss about what's next is needed. And last but not the least, I think the initiatives that the government is driving to drive investment in the biotech sector. Like India was very well known for its generics and biosimilars, but if you also see now, India has also started, the Indian biotech organizations have started looking at new chemical entities or new molecules to be developed from there. So there is a innate desire to invest in new therapies and new molecules into the country as well. And that everything else put together is actually driving the ecosystem of clinical trial conduct. So there's not one single factor that you can pinpoint.
I understand. So, from what I gather is favorable regulation, highly skilled workforce, and a strong focus on patient welfare
Yeah.
has ensured that India has become the hub that it has. Patient welfare, one of the factors there, has been the bedrock of
Yeah.
Indian healthcare. How is Parexel ensuring that the process they follow for clinical trials has a strong patient-centric approach?
Yeah. So I'll tell you one thing. One of the things that's within the DNA of the people that work in Parexel. You talk to anybody, if you just step out and then talk to anybody within Parexel and ask them what is the purpose and the objective that they work in, and you will understand that everything that we do in Parexel, or every decision that we make, we actually try to keep the patient at the heart of every process. So if we are trying to make a process change or a change in a protocol, the first question that's been asked is, how is this going to impact the patient at the end of the line, right? Who's going to get that drug? I think that patient-led approach is very, very strongly driven in the mindset of the people. The reason why they like to work in an industry like this and with Parexel is because of that mindset. The second piece is, in order to drive a patient-led approach, as you rightly mentioned, the reason why we are working in this industry, because at the end of the day, a drug or a therapy, if successful, is going to help a patient either save their lives, or maybe it will further help enhance the lifespan cycle as well. So what we have done is a couple of parameters. So one of the things that Parexel has focused is, every time, the biggest challenge in this industry is because it's such a compliant and regulatory driven process that sometimes the industry gets too bogged down with the procedures and the processes. And we fail to forget that when you're trying to give a 200-page consent form to a patient to sign who probably might be on a deathbed or maybe looking at an alternative therapy, that's not the right way. So what is the right way that you can make a patient's life easier? So in order to address that, Parexel has actually created a patient innovation center, or what we call it as a patient advisory council. It started in US. We created a similar council in Europe, in China, and in India we started that 3 years ago. The whole objective is, we invited actual patients who have whose achenes or they themselves have gone through this life cycle of a clinical trial conduct, and then we are trying to ask them questions in terms of what are the challenges that they're going through, like what is it that we could have done differently or they could have experienced differently when they went through this whole life cycle. So whether it is the socio-economic conditions, avoiding them to participate in a trial, or whether it is the cultural barriers. For sometimes people don't come forward declaring their diseases because of the cultural barriers they go through. Sometimes it's just the affiliation with the investigator side, the doctor, right? How comfortable are they to discuss that parameters? Very interesting facts came on the table. Sometimes it's like there was a patient who had to travel 200 kilometers every time to do a drug dosage to an investigator site because the site was not closer to the home. Then how do you take those considerations, and then the next time when you design a protocol, how do you make those changes so that the entire protocol is patient-centric? And that's what we call it. We came up with a concept called PCPO, it's a patient-centric protocol optimization. So now every time we design a protocol, we try to take these inputs into the play. And we conduct this patient advisory council every 6 months. We are even actually using this patient advisory council to further educate the patients in those therapeutic areas as well. Because most of these patients who have gone through this life cycle, they have that empathy that others should not face the same challenge, and they become then our advocates further when they have to talk to the patients who are going through the same life cycle as to what a clinical trial means, like what does it mean to go through this process, what is the parameters that they need to keep in mind. So all these factors with the patient advisory council putting in place patient-centric focus, and we have also done similar focused councils with the investigator sites, with the nurses, because we have to target every single stakeholder who is going through that cycle as well, and how do you connect all of this together, right? So I think those are some of the initiatives that we're doing in India and globally to make it much more simpler and easier for patients to further participate in clinical trial conduct and get an access to that therapy.
It's really heartwarming to know how Parexel's approach is so well-rounded and the measured steps you are taking to ensure that Indians are able to enjoy a longer lifespan and a healthier life. Be it the Patient Advisory Council or the PCPO or other such steps that Parexel is taking to ensure that this entire process is more patient friendly. How has digital transformation played a role to ensure that those processes are more streamlined and reach the last mile?
Yeah. Uh, Very interesting questions. As we all know that we are living in a digital transformation world, and every month, quarter, there's some new transformation that's coming in, right? But interestingly, in clinical trial perspective, I think you need to be very careful in terms of how you apply the technology, because as I said, you're dealing first of all with a molecule that's yet under a testing phase. It's not an approved molecule. So how do you make a combination of a technology that further enables to get the therapy faster into the market? I'll give you a few examples on that.
Sure.
Let's say, so during COVID, there was a big push to get these therapies faster into the market. Normally, the life cycle is 3 to 5 years to 7 years, as I said, for a vaccine or a therapy to come into the market. But we have seen where therapies were brought into the market in less than 18 to 24 months, right? The reason for that is because, like in Parexel, we actually pivoted to a concept called as using a synthetic arm trial. And in that process, we tried to use a combination of the data that was generated in the clinical world, but also real world evidence and real world data. Now that came in because of the digital data that was existing in the electronic health records. And then we tried to combine that to prove to the authorities that this drug is working and it's faster to bring into the market. So
Sure.
that's one advantage of digital transformation that has come in.
You've used the digital transformation to your strengths and to ensure that people benefit from this entire change. One key issue, that I see with clinical trials is patient recruitment and retention.
Yeah.
There are multiple taboos, hurdles that could be part of the process. What do you think are some of those key issues, and how can India as a country deal with them?
So I think when we sat with the Patient Advisory Council, a lot of our eyes were also open when they started sharing the challenges why patients normally. So one of the biggest challenges is actually the overall understanding of the clinical trial. The challenge is today clinical trial has been looked upon as the last resort rather than as an alternative resort to the therapies that the patients are going on. And that is still the challenge. And the reason that challenge exists is because the education piece of it. Like there are still investigator sites who still are not aware about the therapies that were going in the industry at this point of time for a particular disease, right? Other challenges, even if there are clinical trials happening in US and in Europe, but not necessarily that those trials are happening in India. So unfortunately, the patients sitting here either have to fly onto the other part of the world to become a part of that process. So how do you make sure that you start, India has 1.2 billion or 1.3 billion now patient population out here with the disease burden that exists. How do you make sure that those trials now then could be brought into the India and India gets included in the feasibility as well? So those are some of the hurdles. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, some of the socio-economic factors, there is still a little bit of a cultural barriers also I've seen in the mindset of the people, where people are not very open to come up and talk about their diseases, especially in tier 2, tier 3 cities if you go down. And those become a restriction. Then the other part is also, if you really look at India as a landscape, there's still a huge burden of that patient population sits in the tier 2, tier 3 cities. Investigator sites and hospitals are fantastic in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, right? But then in order for you to make that easily accessible, access available to patients, how do you ensure that the primary healthcare centers, which are running in the small villages and towns, are equipped to conduct those clinical trials and identify those patients? that also becomes a little bit of a challenge. But there are more opportunities out there. So I think those are some of the parameters that are creating some barriers. But I'm sure that there are more workarounds out there as well from a solutions perspective.
Now, while the clinical trials industry is leveraging the opportunities and tackling the challenges in a terrific manner, if I may say, another factor there is how digital health technologies are deeply ingrained in the entire process of clinical trials. What do you see as the future there? And do you see any more opportunities for growth due to this new addition?
Couple of things. I think one of the discussion points that's coming up on the table time and again is that there is so much of data that exists today based on the past therapies, right? But because this industry is a little bit too conservative in terms of sharing that data open, and not only just being the conservatism, there's also an aspect of patient privacy as well, right? We haven't been really been able to leverage some of that past data to see if we can do a predictive analysis before even a drug comes into the market and first patient in. Is there a potential possibility for us to do a predictive analytics using AI ML to see what is the success ratio of that drug before even it's launched, right? That's one area that I think could be a future potential possibility.
Right ahead. On that note, thank you very much, Mr. Vyas. Absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Absolutely. It's a pleasure from my end as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.